Good morning. Hello and welcome to this special live stream recording of Inside Briefing, the podcast from the Institute for Government. My name is Hannah White. Well, it's the morning after the night before. We've got still a handful of seats left to declare, but at the time of recording, we can say this. Labour will form the next government. Keir Starmer will be governing with a very large majority. The Conservative Party has suffered a crushing defeat, the worst in its history. Rishi Sunak's just been speaking on the steps of Downing Street for the last time, held his seat, but a long list of big names are out of Parliament. The Lib Dems are the third largest party in Westminster again, after a hugely successful night for Ed Davey. But what we're going to do this morning is get behind those headlines and work out what happens now. I'm joined, I'm glad to say, by a brilliant trio of IFG colleagues, Giles Wilkes, Haddon and Tim Durrant. It says in my script, you're all looking surprisingly fresh, but I'm not sure that's actually true. How much sleep did you all get?
I managed to get a very focused 3 hours between 4 and 7.
Wow.
And absolutely, because I think by 4 o'clock we kind of knew 95% of what was going to happen, but I missed out the opportunity to see Liz Truss and Jacob Rees-Mogg standing there at their accounts. So, you know, it came at a cost.
I was upset, I have to say, when following you on Twitter, and I saw you say this is a good time to bow out, and I was like, no, Giles, I need your analysis.
Yeah.
Cass, Tim?
I got a good focus, 3 hours, 12:30 to 3:30, because I thought that was the magic time between those early results and then the big counts, as it were, later on.
So we were doing a combination here.
Yeah.
You could pick up Kath.
Yeah, collectively,
coverage,
we've watched all of it.
Tim?
I took the easy route. I slept 12 till 5:30. I feel fresh as a daisy.
Right, I should have said, Tim looks great. OK, Giles, I'm going to start with you. You're our top poll watcher. How do these results tally with what you had anticipated?
They were incredibly surprising in several ways. The first is Labour's vote share. 34 was not scored in any poll in the last year. I don't think Labour have ever dropped to 34% in the polls since Liz Truss was in power. So that was a really big surprise, and it must reflect the dynamics of the campaign, this sort of Palestinian cause-motivated voting, the tactical voting, which is the other really big surprise is, my goodness, are the voters of this country good at tactical voting now? For the first time in their history, the Liberal Democrats have come within a very small handful of seats of having a proportional share of the House of Commons. They are so good at getting their voters to cluster in the right places. And so the other big message is this is the most incredible anti-Conservative vote ever. Almost every single vote, apart from the Conservative one, seems in some way motivated by the simple request to get rid of the last government, which is why I think we shouldn't focus too much on that first thing I mentioned, the 35% for Labour. When tactical voting goes crazy, the overall vote shares go crazy too. What seems to be the case is that close on 80% of the population said we want to see an end to either the Scottish government in Scotland, that was another massive surprise, how badly they did, or the Conservative government in Great Britain. And they were going to use whatever method they absolutely could. The other thing that really surprised me, it's an incredibly important change election, and yet turnout so low. I don't understand why voters were not more motivated to join in at such an important democratic moment.
I think it's worth saying, because a lot of people have focused throughout the campaign at, Labour inheriting this anti-Conservative move, this vote, and there's been a lot of focus on that this morning. But the efficiency of Labour's votes is incredible as well, because yes, they have had higher vote shares, but they have not converted that into seats. And with first past the post, the efficiency of where your vote is spread is crucial.
Yeah.
So, yes, OK, this has been a very strong anti-Conservative and not pro-Labour as much as, perhaps they would like.
Yeah.
But it's the ability of any party to convert the context that they're in into a victory at an election, and Labour have done incredibly well on that front.
Absolutely. And you play the voting system you've got. I mean, if it had been a different voting system, they would have played it a different way and got a different vote share and different outcomes. So they played it brilliantly, and I think the voters got the result they wanted.
And the Lib Dems, as you say, were very good at getting the votes they needed in the places they needed. But they've been left with a pretty right-of-centre electorate for those 71 seats that they've won.
Well, I mean, what I've been told by people who were sort of close to the Lib Dems during the sort of fascinating 15 years they've had is the sorts of seats they're now holding are much more ideologically in line with the sort of liberal, cosmopolitan, metropolitan ethos of the party. So whereas they've had close on this number of seats before under Charlie Kennedy and Nick Clegg in 2005 and 10, there was much more of a kind of Labour haven't been left-wing enough for me kind of shtick going on there, which left them with a lot of seats that they just couldn't defend the moment they had to make those choices in the coalition. So I would say it looks like it might be a much more enduring Lib Dem bloc now, not least because they're now not going to be in government and face some of the same terrible dilemmas you get when you are.
Tim, your team has been crunching some of the numbers. Can you give us some standout figures from your point of view?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, as Giles said, the anti-Tory theme comes through. So of the 270 Conservatives who stood again, who didn't step down their seats, 2/3 of them lost. Wow. In Scotland, 80% of SNP restanders have lost. And of the government, there were 86 ministers, members of the government, who were restanding. 43 of them, a full 50%, lost their seats. So the kind of anti-government vote is really, really strong. I think that's very clear. And, again, sort of this is, compared to historical results, much stronger. So we've got 12 people who were attending cabinet until yesterday who lost their seats. In 2010, 0 members of the cabinet lost their seats. In 97, only 7 did. So, really, really strong sort of localised anti-government votes. Obviously, some of them, there was discussion about whether the Prime Minister and the Chancellor would keep their seats. Both of them did, but quite a lot of the cabinet didn't. In terms of other parties, I think it's interesting as well. So obviously we've got 4 Greens and 4 Reform MPs. How will they sort of pull the government in different directions will be interesting. And in Northern Ireland, there's a nationalist majority of MPs for the first time. So
Giles,
I didn't know that.
On Reform, the exit poll had
Yeah.
them, I think, winning 12 seats.
Yeah,
They only-
13 maybe,
13.
yeah.
So why was that wrong?
I mean, we've had some polling experts hanging around having bacon sandwiches with us this morning. I mean,
You drew them in.
I suspect the people producing that result, remember, they have about 20,000 ballots to look at. They didn't have a stable baseline from 2019 to go off because the Brexit Party disappeared, but didn't disappear consistently. It stood again in places where it could attack Labour. So they had a really difficult job to do there. But if you think about it, those 20,000 ballots, maybe 3,000 of them voted Reform. That's just not enough to make a really strong prediction. And I suspect if they had an absolutely free hand, they wouldn't have made that prediction. It's just, it would have looked biased to say, well, we're fairly certain about Labour and the others, but we're not going to make that statement about Reform. But otherwise, it's very difficult for a start-up party to go from 0 to the kind of lumpy distribution you need to win seats in our system. What the Lib Dems have done is do that over 10 years, effectively. From 2015 to now, their vote share has only gone up a couple of percentage points, and they've turned it into 70 seats. That takes a lot of that on-the-ground work. If Reform ran this thing again with the same vote share, they might get a lot better because they'll know where to concentrate them. But it never looked likely to me that they'd get that many.
Kath, what does this the makeup of Parliament now that Tim's described mean for Keir Starmer's task in governing?
Well, obviously on one level, any government wants a whopping majority. It makes you feel like you're more comfortable in terms of that sort of buffer zone of being able to pass legislation. It means that factions within your party rebelling, you've got, again, a bigger buffer zone to be able to deal with that. It does mean that actually, a lot of the scrutiny of government, it needs the government to want it and to support Parliament in being able to scrutinise and make legislation better and for select committees to be better and so forth. The opposition parties are going to be dependent on the executive wanting Parliament to have its voice and to play a role, because otherwise there is a risk that Parliament just gets sidelined because the executive is so powerful in our parliamentary system.
And could it also mean the opposition is going to come from within the Labour Party? There's the Gaza issue that Giles mentioned. Labour MPs are defending seats against independents who fought on that Gaza platform. There's a strong Green voice, which might pull certain Labour MPs in different directions. Thangam Debonair, Shadow Cabinet, lost her seat to one of the Green leaders. So if the Conservatives are pulled apart and don't know where they're going for the next few months or years, will Labour kind of factionalise just as the Tories did over the last few parliaments?
Yeah, and I think we saw this in the speech that Keir Starmer made in the middle of the night. So it's 3 opportunities for them to talk at their count. in their speech to the party, and then obviously their speech in front of Number 10. And a few observers have pointed out that Starmer seems to be doing the same route that Blair did, which is, focusing on the thank yous at the constituency and on your family, focusing on the party in that middle of the night speech, and then on the country in front of Number 10. And on that party one, he was very strongly saying, the changed political party, we mean it, we're going to continue it. And I assume that was a bit of a warning to his party that, we're not going to backtrack on that, and how we campaigned is how we're going to govern.
He can hope. Giles, what do you think the presence of those 4 Reform MPs in Parliament is going to mean for the Conservatives?
This is really fascinating because, what I've been looking forward to most are the post-mortem analyses from the Conservative side as to which mistake they make, because that's going to define the leadership campaign. What was it? In my view, they built up a massive resentment against them from the sort of Remain centrist Lib Dem side, and we can see that in Lib Dem seats. But there will be a lot of people who will be playing fantasy 2024 election. Imagine if the Reform and Conservative vote share had just been added together, we'd have won. They'll just be making that straightforward statement. It's really tricky because the Conservatives want to be the opposition. That means opposition to Labour, which means attacking whatever Labour's doing. But they're going to be attacked by Reform constantly, who are going to be saying we came within a few percentage points of being an effective opposition instead of you. So I really don't know, because the hostility between those two parties really grew up through this campaign. At the beginning of it all, it felt very glib and easy to say, look at how much more popular Farage is than any Conservative. He's the natural next leader of the Conservative Party. He was at about 12 to 1 at one point to be the next leader of the Conservative Party, which seemed remarkable. And then the hostility between the two, particularly over Putin and racist comments, has really grown up now. So we're going to now see that kind of fighting going on. I think it's going to be really, really messy, but I think it'll also be quite messy within Reform itself. I think they're going to find being in Parliament extremely tedious and unpleasant. And after a while, that's going to just show in their own discipline.
But I don't think it will just affect that Reform-Conservative relationship, because, I think at one point in the night, Reform were second in 98 seats, and a lot of them were Labour seats.
That's a good point.
And also a lot of people were saying that actually it was Labour voters as much potentially switching to Reform. And Farage, again, made that point in his own comments during the night, that basically he's coming for Labour as well. So I think, as well as the left wing of the Labour Party, some Labour MPs are going to be thinking about what Reform on their doorstep means.
I think that's a really good point. But but going back to Hannah's original point about how does Reform affect the Conservatives, the Conservatives being in third place to fight these seats. I remember this. This was the real gut blow to the Lib Dems in 2015. Losing second places means you lose the ability in our voting system to make that pitch to voters that you're the person. So Reform is standing in the way of the Conservatives, saying we're the ones to take over from Labour. And that's really confusing. So it means they're going to have to wonder if they have to do some Napoleonic strategy where they first kill Reform and then come after Labour. And what that means for the next few years. What's your Conservative strategy? Is it first kill Reform, or is it immediately focus on Labour?
Fascinating. Tim, we've just heard Rishi Sunak say outside Downing Street that he's going to stay on until the process for recruiting his successor is confirmed.
Yeah.
Run us through what the next few weeks look like for the Conservative Party.
What has happened for the last few Conservative leaderships has been a whittling down by the MPs to a final 2 and then the membership votes, and that's obviously what Sunak did not win in 2022. Truss beat him with the membership vote, but she never got the majority support of MPs. So will they do that same process? I think the party can change its processes whenever it wants, so they might change something, they might choose something different. But you assume, as Giles and Kath have alluded to, there will be different diagnoses within the party as to what went wrong, and therefore there will be different kind of arguments as to who it should be and what they need to do. So we know that there have been kind of shadow leadership election campaigns going already. Someone I was speaking to the other day said they had a friend who definitely wasn't working for Tom Tugendhat on his leadership campaign. Obviously Suella Braverman has been very outspoken in her criticism of the PM. He's still PM at the moment. There are going to be different wings of the party, each kind of jockeying for that position. I think from a sort of health of the party point of view, it makes sense for Sunak to stay in rather than sort of hand it over to some kind of temporary committee or something like that. But I think there'll be a lot of sort of anguish about how that process works and then who is on the final ballot.
I noticed he only said he would stay in until the process was agreed, so we still might have
some kind of holding
a caretaker.
Yeah.
If anyone at home wants to send us a question, please do. We've had some coming in via Slido, and Nicholas McLean's asked whether anyone on the panel thinks the Conservative Party is likely to split. And if Suella leads the hard right, who would lead the moderates? Any bids for that one?
Wow.
Well, I mean, Jeremy Hunt surviving was a surprise to everyone, and with people like James Cleverly being out, you know, whether or not Hunt throws his hat in the ring again, I don't know.
Did Cleverly lose?
Did Cleverly lose?
No, I don't think he lost.
Cleverly won, but...
Oh, sorry, yeah.
But yeah.
That was probably when I was
You were asleep.
I have those greens too.
That's where the strategy falls down.
But Mordaunt's out, who would have been a natural leader.
Yeah.
And I mean, can you remember, when was it we had the 5 families? Was it about this time last year? Or there were 5 families
God,
of the
I've deleted
Conservatives?
that from my brain.
It became one of the classic pub quizzes. What can you name all of the families of the Conservative Party? But there's the kind of Danny Kruger faction, which used to be the Kruger-Cates faction of traditionalist, family-orientated kind of nativists almost. You've got the Truss people without Truss.
Yeah.
Are there any other people? I mean, has Simon Clarke lost his position? It's very difficult, so we're going to have to do a proper audit of where all these families stand. But I suspect the moderates have done better than people expect in some of this. As you say, Hunt, that's an amazingly important result for the Conservatives, because he's one of the people that even the Labour side grudgingly admit, you know, he hasn't done a bad job, you know, and that's the sort of conservatism that maybe has a chance of lasting.
Yeah, and I mean, the key issue now, first of all, as Sim says, is going to be the process and who gets to control the process, because don't have a 1922 committee, don't have a chair for it. There is a party board, the party chairman narrowly maintained his seat, so who's going to be in charge of the process, deciding the rules, deciding the thresholds of how many MPs support you need to be able to stand to get through each round, and that all-important question of are they going to change the rules to remove the membership vote, and you know, that could be incredibly controversial.
And one point worth making, the first big scalp to make a big exit, apart from Robert Buckland, Grant Shapps, his speech was all about divided parties lose elections. So the idea of splits right now, I mean, can you imagine the voices behind the scenes saying, what, are you mad?
Well, it also puts you at a disadvantage in terms of being the opposition, because you know, so much of that is dependent. You get funding on the basis of it. That is calculated from the point of the election. But there is a lot of ways in which, given how small an opposition they now are, maintaining those numbers is going to be incredibly important for being an effective opposition. So in that sense, it's not in anyone's favour to try and split them off.
Tim, they're small, but they're not as small as some of the MRPs suggested they could be. Do they still have enough to comfortably fulfil the roles that there are in Parliament?
I think
the official
comfortably might be a bit of a stretch, but I think they'll probably get there. So we expect around 90, there's a limit of 95 ministerial posts in the House of Commons. So they've got more than 95 MPs, so they should be able to shadow every ministerial post. Then there's the select committee chairs, there's the select committee members. You know, it might be a bit of a stretch to get everything, or people might be double hatting, which we haven't had recently with shadow ministers not necessarily being on select committees. I think, to Kath's point, it's going to be interesting sort of how they maintain that discipline, because I think, you know, one of the things that Starmer did, you know, his tagline is the Change Labour Party, and he really did maintain sort of rigid discipline on his front bench for the last few years, and that clearly, I don't think is not going to be there for the Tories in opposition. There'll be people criticising the government from different points of view, or, you know, different bits of the party agreeing with different things that the government is doing, or indeed going to reform and agreeing with them. So it's going to be, I think, quite a messy opposition.
I think we may be slipping into the mistake of spending our time analysing what we know, which is the Conservative Party, which we ought to be thinking about is
Labour.
the new government. Kath, tell us, what have Labour been doing to prepare for possibility of day one in government?
Yeah, I mean, they, you know, like the Conservatives before 2010, have had quite a professional organisation in terms of their prep for government, but still the way the UK approaches it, because it's all has to be done during the campaign, it is nothing compared to what, say, the Americans do when they're spending millions of pounds in 3 months preparing for what is a much larger transition of many, many more appointments. But they've done quite a lot of work of thinking through what their plans are for governments, the people that they're taking in, and we assume their early announcements, certainly thinking through the King's Speech, but we will wait and see in the coming days if they are pulling any rabbits out of the hat in terms of surprise announcements that weren't in the manifesto, or how they are going to signal to the public in those early days that they are changed. So that's the bit that no one really knows, because often political parties keep it very, very secret, including sometimes from the civil service themselves. So we'll see over the course of the weekend if there are any sort of announcements over what they want to do. But probably the biggest test will be at the King's Speech, when we see the legislation and the order on the 17th, and the legislation and the order in which they want to bring things in.
And you mentioned our lack of a transition period. I think we're all feeling the consequences of that this morning. But do you think that precise timing of this election, with the summer coming up, will actually give us a slight taste of what a transition period might feel like if the UK did indeed have one?
Yeah, indeed. You know, there will be a few weeks of parliamentary activity, but how long? Again, we wait to see. It depends how much the new government wants to do before summer recess. But yeah, that period, I mean, it'll give them a chance for a holiday. And I mean, frankly, if we want good government, we should want people to go and rest. So that's a good thing. It will also give ministers a bit of time during that period to be in departments, talking to officials, working through policy and so forth, before then really hitting the ground in September and, you know, starting that sort of wheel of policy making, kind of churning onwards and onwards.
Hitting the ground, running.
Yeah.
Tim, we've had an anonymous question. Do we know anything about the new government's position on any machinery of government changes, headcount or structure changes, anything like that?
So we don't formally know anything. I think there were two, when the campaign got going, there were two big questions. One was, what would they do with Angela Rayner's role? She is deputy leader of the party. She was shadowing various different things across government, including Michael Gove in Levelling Up, but also she took on a brief of the future of work, and she was shadowing the Cabinet Office. So where she will sit, will she be the Deputy Prime Minister? We expect that's going to be her role, but exactly what responsibilities she'll have in that role and what she'll pull in from across government is unclear, and therefore there might be structural changes to kind of facilitate that. The other big structural change was, would they do something on international development? They had Lisa Nandy as Shadow International Development Minister. In the manifesto, they committed to running and improving international development from within the Foreign Office. So therefore we expect, whether it's David Lammy or not, he will head up that department, and development will be part of it. I think, as well as the structural changes, actually the degree of change for individual roles is quite interesting. So we've always said, you know, you've been shadowing these roles for quite a long time. Most of the shadow cabinet's been in post for a couple of years. It makes sense to move them into the roles that they're shadowing because they have that subject knowledge, they have that experience. At the same time, there are a couple of people who didn't get elected from the shadow cabinet. So Jonathan Ashworth lost his seat in Leicester, Thangam Debonair lost hers in Bristol. But also, this is Starmer's kind of peak of power, right? He has all the political patronage he can spend at this point. And so if he wants to change his team, he might well choose now to do it and move people around, because nobody is going to be able to oppose him on that. Whether that makes for a smooth transition or not is a different question.
Yeah.
And Kath, what about any machinery of government changes or structural changes to accommodate this new mission-led approach, which Labour said they want to?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question us real geeks about government are waiting to find out.
Very mainstream question.
You know, what are they going to do in number 10, the Cabinet Office? We obviously had a very big commission looking at the centre of government, so lots of suggestions about what they could do to make that work better. But again, it might be something that we see announcements about in the coming days. It would be, again, a way of signalling some change and some ways of wanting to do the process of government differently. We'll also start to see sort of who are the key appointments. Obviously, we know Sue Gray coming in as Chief of Staff, but who are the other key people going to be supporting Starmer in number 10, because getting that sort of team working effectively at the centre is going to be really important. The other thing that we should say, to add to what Tim said, is that we know obviously of some new bodies they want to set up, obviously Great British Energy and also their Ethics and Standards Commission. It might be interesting to see whether they use that arm's length body, public body tool, as another way of sort of signalling things that they want to do. The other thing that I think is a possibility is just seeing some name changes to departments, whether or not they shift some portfolios within departments around. But I mean, we would hope that they won't do any major machinery of government changes, because as Tim said, it isn't necessarily an effective way to kick off your new government.
Inhibits your ability to get on and deliver. Giles, one of the things we said in our Centre Commission was that new governments should be really clear and distill their priorities from their manifestos and then use those to shape their spending decisions. We've got a question from Billy Davis, who says, when do you think we're likely to see a spending review? Do you imagine it'll be a short, one-year continuity one, or something more long-term?
I think, well, we have to have one by a certain time, because otherwise there literally aren't money amounts given out for April. So there has to be one. The question is whether they do a one-year carryover and then try and do something longer and more strategic, or try to do everything this autumn. I think coming with the election basically 2 months later in the year than it was in 2010, they're giving themselves a really big challenge to do it as quickly as the coalition government did in 2010. Now, the coalition government it was the austerity budget. It was an austerity spending review. So it was a very, very difficult challenge. But I personally think that it will be very difficult to get that spending review absolutely right, and, as you say, strategically aligned in such a short period of time. So I would have thought a one-year carryover would make sense. But because Rishi Sunak held this election earlier in the year than everyone expected, the possibility of them trying to do it this autumn is there where it wouldn't have been if they had held on to the autumn. So I do think it's possible they will try to do that fully strategic thing. It's just following your earlier conversation about changes in machinery of government. If there are really different ways of orientating the government around missions, that's a really deep structural change to the way government lasts. The idea that you can do that and get the money right, like the accounting officer responsibility for mission objectives. Are you really going to work that out by October, November? I think that's really tricky. So if I was a betting man on this kind of thing, I would say a one-year carryover and then a really fantastically strategic one in 2025. That's my guess.
Interesting. Kath, Giles mentions accounting officers. Are we expecting any changing of the guard in the civil service?
Well, we've already heard briefing that the Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, is planning on stepping down at the new year. And so might expect a new Cabinet Secretary, and hopefully we'll see a process and see an opportunity for a number of people, including perhaps a first female Cabinet Secretary, to put their names forward for the job. Elsewhere, look, there is always, especially when you have sort of a long period between change of government, you always end up seeing a few people moving on, sometimes because they stayed on to see through the election, and so it's sort of natural tenure coming to an end. There's always sometimes a bit of man management of moving people around if the relationships aren't quite working, or it's just felt that, you know, a particular department needs some sort of new impetus in there. So we could see some changes. Obviously, we don't want to see the kind of political changes that we have seen in recent years, particularly in the Truss government's very political actions, taking out permanent secretaries. So hopefully it will just be the more normal turnover that we see sometimes around changes of government, rather than anything more political.
I think there might be, at sort of below that top level, there might be quite a lot of change, because I think the civil service, you know, has been kind of, well, everyone has been waiting for this election for a while. The last government was not doing a lot for the last few months. There is a sense that sort of people kind of biding their time to see what was happening, and also, you know, if they build mission boards, if they set up new departments, new task forces, whatever it might be, there will be new jobs and new priorities. And so at the kind of middle to lower senior management ranks, I think there will be quite a lot of movement over the next 6 to 12 months or so.
Which will have implications for all those people trying to interact with government who thought they knew who they were talking to. Giles, during the election campaign, we've seen so many articles full of descriptions of the horrors which would be in the in tray of any incoming government. James Tulloch asks, what does this result mean for the level of Labour's ambition in solving those issues in this Parliament? The number of seats suggests a big mandate for genuine transformational change, but the vote share certainly in England, maybe doesn't?
James has asked the most fascinating question, because during the more extreme moments of the election campaign, when those MRPs were coming out putting Labour north of 450, even up to 500 seats, it was possible to imagine that, to use that old cliche, the Overton window was going to be wrenched to one side, and they'd be able to do things, they'd be able to claim a mandate to do quite shocking things that hadn't been expected. So, you know, something fiscal that would, you know, would have raised money and made the public spending issues go away, for example. This one here, we also have a record number of much more marginal seats. The average winning margin is much lower. So a boldness both in kind of central government action, but also like allowing development in my area, to mention the planning area, is going to be a bit more difficult.
Especially with lots of Labour MPs in southern England now.
Yes, exactly.
With narrow majorities.
Very much so. And also the whole checkerboard of our political system, where they're thinking, as Kath pointed out, we're facing reform here, so I've got to make sure I don't sound too pro-European up here. And then I'm facing, it's the Lib Dems who are more interesting down there. So it's going to take a little while for that to resolve. I would have thought, though, that Labour had been very, very clear not to be complacent in assuming this result, like a lot of us commentators have been for, let's face it, months. They will be thinking, we have 400 seats. This is something we didn't dare to think. We now really, really do have a mandate. There's no chance at all of us being pitched out of government. We can plan for 4 or 5 years. We've all along said that stability is our absolute secret weapon here, and that we are able to promise stability in a great way. And I think also they'll regard the circumstances of 2024 as slightly unique, so we shouldn't worry too much about all that game playing around seat majorities and so forth. They can plan on the idea that they can be in power for longer than one term if they just deliver and don't mess up and do some of the foolish things that prevented Boris Johnson from doing the same thing. So I think it does give them that big mandate. I think they just need to calm down a little bit, that there's too much talk about 100 days, as if on day 101 they've just got to go, oh, that's it, we just hang on until 2028 now. So I think they can, but they need to just calm down and plan them.
Yeah, they need to. I loathe the 100 days sort of thing, because it just implies like rushing through things, coming in with a sense of, or giving a sense to the public that some of this stuff is going to take time.
Yes.
We've certainly seen them do that and trying to manage expectations. Their biggest problem, though, is that, you know, the election campaign, especially those final few days, all you saw anywhere was the word change. And if your one message to the public is change, then you've damn well got to deliver it.
And given the shift we've seen between the election in 2019 and 2024, do you think it is possible to satisfy, Giles, the British public with the change it is possible to deliver in 5 years?
Well, what's really strange about this election campaign is, yes, it's a change election. Get rid of that lot and bring us in. But also they've emphasised continuity and reassurance. And people have been making those smart comments about how Hunt and Reeves aren't all that difficult. They now need to make it clear what the change actually means. They need to really build that narrative quite early, where they say, look, we are new, therefore we're going to do some things you didn't expect. Because that whole very tedious narrative of the man in the street going, oh, they're all the same, aren't they? They really need to take that on. And I think there are certain things. There'll be symbolic policies, like I've seen speculation that the 2-child benefit cap, they'll find money to deal with that. And that will really send a signal to everyone from the centre-left to the left that they really are a new government. But I think it's also an opportunity for them to tell the voters, we can give you a bargain. We're going to raise money in some ways and we're going to spend it and you're going to see results for public services. And I think they've got an opportunity now. The voters are listening, and a lot of the voters were telling people, we expect that to happen, at least the raising money part. So they're right now, the one thing that is right about the 100-day thing is there is a period when the voters are listening and are kind of accepting of the idea that they're going to be spoken to like grown-ups. And I think they need to do that in the next few months.
Tim, you've done a lot of work over the last Parliament on standards and ethics. Do you think there's an opportunity for a new government to mark itself out with the public on that front?
I mean, that's one of Starmer's big tickets, right? That, you know, we are different to the Conservatives on this front. That's what he wanted to portray the Labour Party as. And I'm sure he'll say something about that when he speaks in Downing Street shortly. He made a big deal about he talked about politics that treads lighter on people. He wants people to feel less annoyed and stressed by politics, I think. And part of that will be about kind of how the ministers in his government behave. So yeah, I would expect they will want to try and do that. At the same time, given everything we've talked about in terms of the different flanks they're going to be facing in Parliament, and also the fact that you've got a lot of new MPs who have not been in Parliament before, and ministers who've only ever been opposition MPs, I'm sure people will make mistakes. And he set himself a very high bar. He said in that biography that if Rachel Reeves broke a rule, he would fire her. So if he's going to hold everybody, all of his allies, to really high standards, at some point someone will make a mistake, and it will be damaging to the government. And to Giles's point, Labour would say, well, we're not going to behave as badly as the Conservatives, but people will see politicians sometimes make mistakes, and it won't necessarily help the kind of showing the difference argument.
And we've argued there are a few structural things they should probably do which would help those politicians not make those mistakes.
Indeed, and you can read all about it on our website.
You can. Kath, I'm going to give you the final question. We've had a few questions come through about PR and what we think this result does for arguments about PR. I suspect I know the answer, but...
Well, I mean, you've already heard Nigel Farage talking about it, so we know one particular party is going to join forces with the Lib Dems to
Lib Dems
try...
might not want it.
Lib Dems don't need it anymore. Yeah. They've worked out how to win under it.
I think Labour would be pretty happy with first past the post right now. So I cannot see anything happening on that front, but obviously the argument is not going to go away. What's been interesting is obviously seeing the few Conservatives talking about how, especially when they were talking about supermajorities and so forth, of suddenly discovering that the system, if you are not the government, can not be as helpful for you. So that was a little bit ironic, but yeah, it's obviously an argument that's not going to go away from this, particularly when you're looking at the vote share and how that's translated into seats and so forth. But I don't think it's going to change the new government's policy.
Seems unlikely. Well, that's it for this special edition of Inside Briefing. Many thanks to Giles Wilkes, Kath Haddon and Tim Durrant for joining us. Well done, everyone. You can go and have some more coffee now. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thanks for all the brilliant questions you sent in. I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to all of them. If you've enjoyed this, then please do check out our live blog, which we're running throughout the weekend. Tim will be masterminding that, so no sleep for you, Tim, sorry. But that will be tracking every step of the government formation with lots of fascinating facts and figures about the roles which new people will be fulfilling and the challenges that they will be facing. It's going to be a big day, a big weekend, and a momentous time for British government. So make sure you stick with the Institute for Government every step of the way. See you next week.